It's anticipated releases time. Woo woo. Oh god. Oh, yeah, clearly PTO is not going very well. Hey everyone, Fina here from Fina Reads. Welcome back to my preview of 2022 series. This is the last video in the preview part. Well, it's the last day of December if you watch it on the 31st. So yes, of course, duh, Josefine. But starting in January, I will focus on the review 2021 part. So definitely stay on the lookout for these types of videos. But today we are focusing on anticipated releases, and I'm looking at the first half of the year. Also, I want to mention the majority of books that I'm looking at are from the typical fantasy and sci-fi publishers like Orbitor. I looked into self-published books, but for whatever reason I was not able to find a good list. Just wanted to say up front that I'm sorry about not including too many self-published books in this list. I was really trying to look for some. So if you know any self-published books that are coming out in 2022 that are not necessarily continuation of series, because I found a lot of those, but new series or new standalones, please let me know down in the comments, because then we can add that to the list of anticipated releases through the comment sections of YouTube, which would be really exciting. So, and just in case you're wondering, I have my long list over here because, as you know, I have a hard time remembering stuff. So I have my cheat sheet over here, and I separated the list into two parts. The first part of the list are 7 books that I'm really excited about and that I very likely am going to pick up at one point or another. And then I have a second part with 6 maybes where I might want to look a little bit closer first once they are published. And please know, this is not an extensive list. These are just the books that I saw that I'm excited about. And I want to start with Rise of the Mages by Scott Drakeford, which sounds like a very typical epic fantasy series with mages and whatnot. It sounds like a coming-of-age story with the main character being in a warrior school that then discovers he has hidden magical talents and has to use those in order to save the faith of the world. You know, that type of fantasy story is what it sounds like. It's actually book 1 of a series. The one thing that got me excited about this one, though, is not just the coming of age part, but it sounds like there's a lot of intrigue woven into that as well, not just political, but also religious intrigue. There was mention of priests not being happy with how certain things are going. So that is the stuff that really got me excited about that book. Next on my list is Scorpica, which is book 1 in the 5 Queendoms series by G.R. Macallister. And again, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing any names wrong. I apologize up front for all of that already. I'm trying. This book got me excited because the main setting is a queendom or a matriarchy, which you don't see very often, especially not in classical fantasy. And the premise of the book is that all of a sudden no girls are born anymore, which is a bad thing for a matriarchy. that sounds not good. And then, of course, as you can imagine, alliances are tested. You have new enemies all of a sudden. You have to build new connections and new relationships. And that's what sounds really interesting to me when it comes to this book. So what I'm hoping for is that this is really about building the relationships and figuring out who is on your side, who is not. Both of the first 2 books are February releases, so you know, the year's starting off pretty good already. Book 3 is a series continuation. It's Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse. I read Black Sun in 2020 when it came out, and I loved it. It was one of my favorite books of 2020. I thought that this fantasy setting is so uniquely done. If you have no idea what Black Sun is, it's South American inspired fantasy story with South American, I think Colombian. I don't want to misspeak. I'll double check and I will put it in the text here down below. But I think it is Colombian folklore that is woven into the story. And it has some really interesting main characters. It starts off really weird with a mother basically jumping off the balcony to bewitch her son or bewitch the future of her son or something like that. And the first book is all about different characters preparing for that main event that is happening at the end of the book in that main city. And that main event is supposed to change the world order. And book 1 ends with the day after the main event. And there are some things that happen where I was just sitting there. It's like, this is a humongous cliffhanger. And I cannot have that she is having me sit here like this for over a year now. So this is definitely so high on my anticipated release list. I will read Black Sun before it comes out, so I just, remind myself of all the good things that happened with Black Sun. But I need to know how this continues. Book 4 on my list, I'm not actually so sure if it falls into the fantasy category, but it has some fantasy-sounding elements in the description. And that is All the Horses of Iceland by Saara Tolmie. And it has more a literary approach, I think, to it. But it sounds like it has some Icelandic, but also Mongolian folklore woven into. And it feels like it's more like a historical fiction with a little bit magical elements in there. Magic in the furthest sense. So more in the sense of folklore, not in the sense of someone having magical abilities. So this is probably one of the books that is going to be the most off on that list, or the least typical fantasy book. And I actually don't think it even is part of the fantasy genre. I think it is covered under fiction or literary fiction. But when I saw the cover for the very first time and when I saw the title for the very first time, I just had to put it on my anticipated release list because Iceland, horses. Yes. And just because I had a hard time summarizing what it is about, I'm reading a paragraph from the description. It says, Horses of Iceland tells the tale of a Norse trader, his travels through Central Asia, and the ghostly magic that followed him home to the land of fire, stone, and ice. His search for riches will take him from Helmgard through Khazaria to the steppes of Mongolia, where he will barter for horses and return with much, much more. Yeah, I'm excited about that one. Book number 5 is The Kaiju Preservation by John Scalzi. For this book, I'm just hoping for some fun entertainment. I loved Scalzi's humor in The Android's Dream. It was perfect for what I like. I like dry humor and snarkiness and just witty comments, and that's what I'm hoping for in this part. Plus, I'm wondering if the kaiju here, because it's about big dinosaurs that live in a parallel universe that need to be saved. Also, the book plays in New York City in the middle of the COVID pandemic, so it's very fitting for the current time. And I just hope that the kaiju part aligns to the kaiju that you know from movies like Pacific Rim. I'm pretty sure it is, but The next 2 books are the self-published books that I have on my list. First up is book number 2 in the Josefine series. I've read book 1 a bit earlier this year, and it's kind of a paranormal romance with a witch that has the same name as me, so it has to be my story, right? That lives in Germany. Vampires are also a big part of, and I loved book 1 enough. It was really an easy read. It was a fun ride, getting to know Josefine and getting to know the witch and getting to know the city in Germany she's living in. And there were a lot of things that I just knew from growing up in Germany, so I was very excited about seeing all of those things. And book 2 is coming out in May 2022, and I'm really excited about it. Already pre-ordered. And then the last book in the anticipated series section, the books that I really have high on my list, is a new series by Zamil Akhtar. I have no idea what it's going to be about. I have no idea what the name is going to be, or how many books in the series there are. I just know I loved his Gunmetal God series. I've read all 3 books that are out so far. The series is not finished yet, but I've read those 3 books and loved his imagination. He didn't say anything yet. He just left a comment on social media somewhere where he said that he's currently working on a new series that he's hoping to publish in the next months. And that sounds like the first half of 2022 to me. Now let's talk about my maybes. And they are maybes because, well, I will talk about each individual book and will tell you why they're on my maybe list. They definitely caught my eye. But the description didn't fully convince me, but it also didn't put me off so much that I don't want to read it at all. Maybes. That's the definition of maybe. Starting with The Engines of Empire by R.S. Ford. Engines of Empire is a book where I definitely want to hear more reviews and read more in-depth analysis without spoilers, because what it sounds like is a more classical fantasy underlying storyline, but it sounds like a military fantasy with some steampunk-ish elements in there. At least there's a talk about machines and, weaponry also sounds more advanced than typical medieval fantasy would be. So I'm not so sure. That's not necessarily the type of fantasy that I like. I definitely want to read some more reviews and see how much there is when it comes to military fantasy and how much it is about fighting and war versus, especially with guns and machinery, which are not necessarily things that I like about fantasies. The next book is Goliath by Tochi Onybuchi, and again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing this name, which is a sci-fi in the near future, and it is a premise around the world is falling apart, so we are moving humanity to some space colonies, but only the rich can go, and it talks about how Earth continues to live on in that kind of destroyed. And this is something that I generally enjoy every now and then reading, although enjoying is kind of a weird word when it comes to a setting like this. But it has to be done well. So I want to see, again, here some more. I just want to see some reviews first. The next series that I have an eye on is The City of Dusk by Tara Sim. And the reason why I think it sounds interesting is the magical elements in there. There's some necromancy, there's some elemental magic. Generally, it sounds like a typical fantasy, right? Where something goes wrong and there is a certain set of people who save the world. Like, that's kind of what the description sounds like. But the magical abilities that those 4 people have sound interesting. Again, from that short description, that's all I've read so far. The only thing that makes me hesitate on this one, the cover and the description sound a bit YA. Not saying that YA books are generally awful, they're not. There are some really good ones. This is why I definitely want to see some reviews and hear people explain what the writing style is for that book, because it sounds interesting again, but I've been burned with interesting sounding YA books that were just where the writing was just not something that I enjoyed. Next up is a story collection called The Way Spring Arrives. What I find really interesting about this one is, first of all, it's Chinese science fiction and fantasy stories. Second of all, they're making a point in talking about that it's written and edited by women and non-binary people. Generally, I think this is great. The only time I don't think this is great if it's used as a marketing ploy. And that's what I want to figure out with that book, because they made such a big fuss around this aspect that I'm wondering if they're using it to sell more of the book. Because that is a trend right now. I mean, again, it is important to talk about these things. It's important to be inclusive, right? Me saying this has nothing to do with that. But I also know that companies that all of a sudden have big diversity programs, right? Or that know that this is a trend word, especially younger millennials and younger generations are looking for, it is often misused to sell more. And it actually doesn't mean anything at the end of the day. And that's what I want to figure out with that book first. While I applaud, the publisher's effort on, first of all, looking into other countries and other cultures to find sci-fi and fantasy stories, because we definitely need more of those. And then also making sure that, especially in a culture like the Chinese culture that is very male-driven, finding female writers and female editors and non-binary writers and editors, I think that is amazing. So I just want to make sure that that this is an honest approach and not a marketing machine to try to sell more of the books. I hope that makes sense. 2 more books. Book number 5 on my maybe list is Kaikeyi, again, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, by Vaishnavi Patel, which is an Indian mythology inspired fantasy book. And that alone, when I saw that, I was like, oh yeah, I loved Machinehood a lot, and that had some inspiration from the Indian culture. So I was like, ooh, that sounds really interesting. This is something I want to read. But then I read, for fans of Circe and books like that, I'm like, this is something I do not enjoy as much though. Because while they are considered fantasy, it has a very literary writing style, and I don't like that when it comes to fantasy. Not saying it's bad, again, right? I don't enjoy it as much. So if that book would be similar to that and is more on the literary side than on the fantasy side, I probably would not enjoy reading this book. So hoping it is not, and that it is just a really fantastic Indian mythology based fantasy story that I can use to learn more about the Indian culture in general and their mythology. And the last book is a bit similar. It's The Final Strife by Saara El-Arifi, which is an African/Arabian inspired fantasy series. And I love Middle Eastern inspired fantasy. I've really learned to like it. I actually should probably do a separate video on fantasy that has inspiration from that area of the world, because I love it. Every book that I've read that had a Middle Eastern core, I loved it. Like S.A. Chakraborty's David trilogy, Zamil Akhtar's Gunmetal God series, they were all just fantastic, and they were always high on my list of books that I'd like to read. So this is what I'm hoping for here as well. The only thing that makes me hesitate, the way this is described, it sounds like a Hunger Games type trope, and also it sounds YAE. Again, not that YAE is something bad, but it makes me just hesitate for a second, where I want to just take a look at reviews once it's out, want to hear some other booktubers on their thoughts. That's my 13 books that I wanted to talk with you about in my 2022 anticipated releases in the fantasy sci-fi genre. Again, first half of the year. Second half will follow in June. So what is one book for you? What is either self-published or traditionally published, a book that you're really excited about in 2022? Let me know down in the comments. And then don't forget to, the usual, subscribe and like, because it does help out. And then I hope I see you soon with my next video. Till then, have a great rest of your day. Bye.